Good evening. My name is Caitlin Miller, and I am the Director of Education here at Planet Word, which you can see behind me and my digital background. I'm so pleased to welcome you tonight to this virtual program. Planet Word, in addition to our wonderful gallery experiences, is pleased to put on a variety of virtual and in-person public programs to help people think more about the ways in which words, language, and reading shape our lives. Now, I'm obligated to say that these programs are made possible through the support of people like you who become members of the museum and who donate to the museum. So I have dropped a link in the chat for ways you can learn more about how to do just that. I'll point out that the holidays are right around the corner, and it may be that a membership to Planet Word is just the thing that someone special in your life might need. But tonight, I am very excited that Planet Word is presenting The People's Tongue with Chang-rae Lee. Our moderator is Ilan Stavans, the Lewis-Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, the publisher of Restless books, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. His latest book is The People's Tongue, Americans and the English Language, which has served for the inspiration of this public programming series. Ilan is joined by Chang-rae Lee, the author of 6 novels, Native Speaker, A Gesture Life, Aloft, The Surrendered, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, On Such a Full Sea, which was a finalist for the NBCC and won the Heartland Fiction Prize, and his most recent novel, My Year Abroad. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Planet Word, for this opportunity to continue to host this occasional series, The People's Tongue. It is based, as she was mentioning, on an anthology that came out early this year of the same name, The People's Tongue, Americans and the English Language, which surveys the transformation of our national language from before our independence to the very present. And it includes politicians and poets and lexicographers and activists and actors and novelists and a whole variety of individuals who have offered a statement about the language in their particular time and space. And one of them is Chang-rae Lee, who has a piece in the book about his own upbringing and his encounter with the English language. So before I go directly, Chang-rae, it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you again, both ends of geographically of the country. You are in Stanford, I am here in Amherst, but with much in common, especially the English language. So looking forward to this conversation.
Nice to be here, Ilan. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to also encourage everybody who is listening to us to, as Caitlin mentioned, use the Q&A, or is it the Q&A or the chat, to offer comments, questions, and when Chang-rae and I kind of wrap up the main course of our dialogue, I will switch and be looking at them, not before, and attempt to insert them, reflect on them. It's in the Q&A. Thank you. And last but not least, I am an incredible fan of this place, Planet Word. It is a museum about and of and for the word itself, the spoken word, the written word, and just such a concept is extraordinary. The fact that it is words that are transient, that evaporate the moment we use them, that can be housed in this temple. I encourage everybody to visit it in person and also to support it in any way you can. All right, Chang-rae, let's begin. As an immigrant to an immigrant, I'd love for you to begin with a reflection as of now. You're 58, 57, I don't know, somewhere
58.
there. 58. in your relationship with both the language of your parents, Korean, the language with which you arrived to the United States when you were a very little child, I think 3 years of age or thereabouts, and the English language that has been your main conduit, your tool, both as a writer and as a teacher. Henry James once said that if the first tongue that we have is the mother tongue, then the one we adopt could be the mistress tongue or the spouse tongue. I wonder if those terms sit well by you, still calling it the mother tongue, if you would use another image, and what kind of relationship you have to these languages.
Well, I would absolutely call it the mother tongue, even though I don't consider myself a fluent Korean speaker anymore. You know, my Korean was fully formed as a 3-year-old, and my parents told me that that I was actually a quite advanced speaker from the age of 3, 4, and I spoke Korean exclusively until the time I went to primary school. And I remember the first year, you know, in kindergarten, not knowing anything that was going on. Basically, I listened the entire year. But by first grade, as we know how, you know, the human mind can work and its capacities, I was pretty fluent. And after that, my parents, and I think this is the case with a lot of immigrants, particularly back in the 60s and 70s, you know, they really wanted me to assimilate. They wanted me to blend in. They certainly didn't want me to do poorly in school. And so they really encouraged me, as did my teachers, to only use English and to read as much as I could, to really flex and work out that muscle as quickly and as extensively as I could. And I did. So I went from someone who, you know, was completely illiterate and non-functional as a speaker to someone probably by the age of 9 or 10, starting to lose the language. And that's partly also because, as differing from some of my friends, Korean American friends, who grew up with, say, grandparents in the home or other people in the home who did not speak English on a, you know, that couldn't communicate at all, couldn't even understand English. Those friends of mine held their English. You know, they were able to retain it. And so,
I mean, they're Korean.
They're Korean, right?
Yeah.
And so at this point in my life, even though I could go to Korea and have basic conversations and read basic things, and I'm really not someone who thinks in Korean. At the same time, when you say mother tongue, when I hear Korean, I think I'm much better and much more attuned to listening and understanding Korean rather than speaking it, because I just don't have opportunity to practice Korean as I once did. A different kind of switch, I think, goes on inside me, and it's not an intellectual switch. It's a switch of some kind of. It has this you know, particular emotional valence. It has you know, a strum, a rhythm that feels more like poetry than something informational. So even when I just go to a restaurant, and of course I can communicate with the waiters and this is what I want, my accent's probably not good anymore, but just actually, you know, my engagement and interaction with the language, whether I'm listening to it or trying to use it, it absolutely puts me in a different place as a person. And of course all immigrants feel this way. In terms of my work, no, it's not, you know, the work is, as with any writer, it's an amalgam of so many both verifiable and mysterious things that happened in your life. One of them, of course, for me, the major one is language, but the Koreanness and the Korean language itself is not really part of, you know, my kind of daily activity here at my desk. Although, of course, the Korean, you know, experience and the experience of culture and a family, all that stuff, you know, it's always there. It may be not primary for certain stories. It may be not important for certain stories. It may not be something that is relevant. But of course, it's it's always resident in me and present.
I have plenty of follow-ups, and I will see where I can go or I can't go. Chang-rae, the piece of yours that appears in The People's Tongue is about silence in many ways. It's the silence that you had before acquiring the English language, but it's also the silence of your mother as she tried to make her way through an English-speaking neighborhood, buying groceries and others, and she couldn't pronounce the words. She didn't have the vocabulary. She had her children to help her, and often in families of immigrants, the young children function as they have already accelerated their knowledge of the English language as translators, interpreters, and navigators of their parents. So the first question here is really about the silence that your parents had, your father and mother, as you were growing up. And I don't know, I know you, but I don't know so many details of your upbringing. And I don't know if you're the oldest or the youngest or an only child. And it often happens that those, depending on where you are on the scale of siblinghood, the older can retain the original language in a way that the younger or the youngest doesn't. So I wonder if you could offer me a bit more of an insight into the family, but around language,
Yes,
around
of course.
that experience.
Well, we are two children in our family. My sister is 2 years younger, and I'm the oldest child. And so but as I mentioned, we were not in an ethnic enclave. I didn't grow up in, say, part of Queens where most people were Korean. We were the only Korean family for a long time in our town. Before that, there was one other, but so really, I grew up with the idea that, indeed, as you say, I would become the interpreter, the ambassador,
Right.
the negotiator, the navigator of not just language, but of course what comes with language, with culture. And so I, and that for me was a point of more duty and frustration than of any kind of, it's not a position or mantle that anyone really wants to have. And as a young child, of course, there's this huge disparity of power and of command. But with your parents, and particularly my mother, my father was off at work most of the day, so I didn't see him. But especially with my mother, who had to run the household, who was doing all the things you were saying, going to the bank, going to the grocery store. And I know many immigrant children feel this, have had the same experience. I found myself at the point of the spear many times, not wanting to be embarrassed, sometimes ashamed for her, never really ashamed of her. And I think the reason is because I always knew my mother, and this is, I think, a point about silence is silence in a language and in a public space. But my mother was, I knew from a very early age, and everyone else around us knew this as well. She was a very, very capable, proud, impressive person.
Right.
And in Korean, she could command any room. Yeah. In Korean, people came to her for advice, for solace, she was somebody who had a certain kind of magnetism, but that magnetism just completely disappeared out on the street.
Right.
Because of course, in English, because she did not have the currency by which she could impose herself, make herself known, and what have you. And so from a very early age, I understood something. It wasn't really about my mother. It was about the power of language and how language to an amazing extent determines us, sometimes warps us in our journey through it. Yeah. And so I always felt that a certain kind of sorrow for my mother, because I knew she had that the personality that she exhibited was not her personality.
How did you, Chang-rae, carry on as you grew up, as you entered your teens and your 20s, and then afterwards with that sorrow? And how did your mother carry on with that sorrow? Because, you had arrived as a child and you had the sponge brain that you could incorporate your new words and adapt yourself. But she was already an adult. I don't know. Did she have English before? I think she studied English before.
Most Koreans who went to university studied some English, but of course, as we studied other foreign languages, it was only she could read and write and understand, but her speaking was pretty much non-existent. And she died young. She died when she was 50. So it was probably not until the last, she came to this country when she was in her late 20s.
Yeah.
And it was probably not until, oh goodness, 15 years of living here and trying, being in an integrated society, that she felt comfortable enough to, have a quote unquote American friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did she feel for this country what you feel?
I think she always felt, and less so towards the end of her life, but I know that in the beginning there was always some kind of sense and talk, more sort of theoretical about perhaps going back to Korea.
Yeah.
And I think that was clearly, it's not as if we were doing fine, economically or financially. My sister and I were doing okay in school. We had friends, so it's not like we had any kind of difficult life. But as our lives as children became more and more integrated, more and more comfortable, more and more, just feeling like we belonged, I think my parents, as a lot of parents do, immigrant parents do, I think they realized there was a limit to where they could end up.
Yeah.
And that limit, I think, weighed on my mother more than my father, because he was out in the world, he was working, he was accelerating in his assimilation, rather than in the case of my mother, which was it was just by dint of her own efforts to move along.
The ethos, at least the ethos that we hear about, and I think probably you and I would say it is the case, but I don't know if everybody would, is that immigrants move to another place, yes, for themselves, but also, and probably mainly for the next generation, who they want to have a better life, more opportunities. And so there's a sacrificial endeavor in that astonishing generation, that does it and feels that frustration and that sorrow because you and your sister could have what you have now. And I wonder at the same time, depending on the immigrant always, but sometimes there's this sense of, all right, my kids are well established. You were talking about the more theoretical desire of going back. I wonder if that desire had also the other side, which is the regret. Well, now that I know that I succeeded in that, I wonder what my own life could have been had I X, Y, or Z.
Yes, absolutely. That's that alternate reality,
Right.
Alternate trajectory. I think, my mother, again, she was actually a sort of famous woman in Korea at the time. She was the point guard of the national basketball team.
Ooh.
And she was also had a feature in Time magazine because for that reason, the American Time magazine.
Wow.
So she was someone that people knew.
Yeah.
So she had a very, as you can imagine, a completely different life in the suburb of New York City.
Yeah.
Anonymous, unheard. And I'm not trying to suggest that she was a miserable person and always sad, but I knew, and she was always endeavoring, and she was always, trying to be happy, and she had lots of friends. She ended up with lots of friends, but I know that at the end of her life, she died of cancer, so we knew that she was dying. You know, she thought a lot about her choices, and the choice for also her children, which was, you know, and Richard Rodriguez writes about this in The Hunger of Memory, about the children of immigrants taking on this mantle of language that is in many ways not as accessible for, you know, there's a language of love, but you're being educated and acculturated away from your family, and I think that weighed on her a little bit too, as towards the end of her life, and it weighed on me.
How so?
Well, you know, I never had trouble communicating with her ultimately.
Yeah.
But I always sometimes wondered about how our communications would have been had we really shared language. Because in the end, we really didn't.
Right.
I could not speak Korean well enough. She could not understand English well enough.
Yeah.
You know, to the fine degrees. Maybe someone would argue language is overrated in certain moments. but,
Do you think, Chang-rae, that you talk about silence, and you talk about silence in your writing, and in that piece that I mentioned, and we've been talking about silence. Do you think that silence is different in different languages, or are all silences the same? Because I think it would be easy and maybe lazy to say that silence is the absence of words. But even if you put it that way, because words have a particular rhythm and resonance and texture and feel, well, if it's the absence of words, then depending on the language, that absence feels different.
Absolutely, but I think silence is not just the absence of words, because silence has a preemptive power.
Yeah.
A power that I think when you feel as if there is a fundamental silence, you're not able, or you're not willing, or you don't want to move to another level of feeling, thinking, being sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, it curtails. And so I think that's the tragedy of silence. Not that things aren't said, it's that maybe they're not possible to be said because you're never going to get there, or even expressed through other means.
Yeah.
And that for me is, you know, you asked about, you know, the earlier, what the kinds of things that how it shaped me. And I think one of the ways it shaped me was, I don't think it's a surprise or that much of a leap to see that I became a writer, or someone interested, just absolutely interested and obsessed with language.
Because of this difficulty in communicating.
Yes, absolutely. I had no difficulty communicating with my chums at school, but at a deeper level of communicating about, you know, the whatness of our household growing up, or, you know, the longing that an immigrant might have for a place that's forever gone. Right. You know, that kind of, to find a language for that, and to constantly push to be heard, and to be heard in a way that I was crafting, rather than it being determined for me by context or anything else. That's what, you know, being a writer gives to me. That's the, you know, people always asking me, do you enjoy being a writer? And I don't know if the enjoy is the right word, but what I do appreciate about it and cherish about it is it gives me that freedom.
Yeah.
And it's not just the freedom to imagine, but it's the freedom in the context of our conversation, about maybe diving into those silences we've been talking about, and really picking them apart and saying, how do I express in words some of these things that have gone on in my life?
The biggest challenge, right? This is
yes.
That it's all about. And when it succeeds, it can succeed beautifully and offer, you know, kind of epiphany to others. And I know also the frustration of trying to get into that silence, and sometimes feeling that one I'm not ready yet to dig into something, because it's too raw, or it's too
Mm.
there's a larger topic. I don't know if this question, Chang-rae, how it would resonate with you, but I'm still with your mother, so I still want to stay there for a few minutes. I immigrated to this country much later than you. You came when you were 3. I came when I was 24. So it's the paradigm was very different, and one assimilates or incorporates or acculturates into language in a different way. One already has certain tools to navigate the world. I wonder, though, and often do, if we immigrants, once we start acquiring the receiving place language, if the language of our dreams also changes, I mean, the way the dreams narrate themselves, the things that are said in the dreams, etc. But let me qualify this a little bit, because I have 2 siblings. I'm the oldest, a brother and a sister. And my brother is a musician, and I have a very hard time keeping a tune. Music, I adore music, but I can't. Words are my tools. Music is his. And he tells me that his dreams are sonic, that he hears things, and he hears them and then sees them. And in my case, I know that people are talking in a dream, but I don't hear them. And I hear and I know what they are saying, but I don't hear the words. It's because sometimes people ask me, are they speaking in Spanish?
Right.
Are they speaking in Yiddish, or are they speaking in English? And I don't know, because I don't hear them, but I do know that they are talking and I understand what they're saying. So I wonder if, I mean, you were very little when you were switching from Korean into English, and I don't know if it's possible to talk about the kind of the texture of dreams particularly at that age. But I wonder if you could extrapolate to your mother's, that frustration also projects itself in the dreams that we have, in the way they manifest themselves. Any way you want to go with this question, or dismiss it?
Well, that frustration is really an anxiety, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And of course, dreams are all about anxiety to me. Sometimes I do have dreams of elation, which are very few and far between. So my elation dream is that I can dunk a basketball. I always loved playing basketball, but of course could never dunk, being 5'9". But most of the dreams are of anxiety, and the dreams that are associated with family, and particularly my mother. I would say that it's funny, going back to that with your first term, mother tongue, is that I do hear her voice.
Yeah.
I don't hear a lot of Korean in my dreams, but I hear her voice in my dreams. And of course she's speaking sometimes English in the way that she did, but mostly she's speaking Korean to me or to someone else. And that to me tells me something about what's entwined in my, in the fabric of both my DNA and of my
No doubt.
my epigenetic code. That is something that I guess I would never, particularly as a writer, and as you too, that's something, and I'm sure there are lots of writers listening to this, and may listen to this podcast or this webinar, that's the very material that you really need to explore and to tease out and have lots of questions about, and interrogate too. Like, why is this anxiety so long-standing? And has it changed for me? What are my issues? Not personally so much, but say artistic issues.
Yeah.
What do I really care about as a writer now?
Yeah.
As particularly as an immigrant writer. Someone who's an immigrant, and who's much of whose work talks about, is, as yours, concerned with borders and silences and all. How has that changed for me? you know,
Yeah.
and where do I go from here in that journey?
You know, just staying for a second on that issue of the anxiety of dreams, I think that between the way we engage with reality and the way we engage with dreams, or the dreams engage with us, is that I see a lion in life and get afraid. In dreams, I get afraid and then see a lion.
Yeah,
It's the
that's
fear
right.
that will project
That's
into
right.
this lion.
Well, we
And
conjure,
we
right?
conjure that one.
We
You,
conjure.
you, you kind of made a little twist in the way you were delivering the last sentence, where you said, I was an immigrant, I am an immigrant. So I wonder if 50 plus years, say 55 years, and I ask myself the same question, at what point is the immigrant no longer an immigrant? Is the immigrant forever an immigrant? And if you are forever an immigrant, what are the gradations, the different stages one goes through in order to be as fluent as you are, as versatile in controlling and corralling the words, but at the same time still feel that you are an outsider. Of course, outsider, insider is at the core of what you write, also at the core, right?
Well, I think you're locating a point of being for people like us. You know, I think at some point, once and it happens fairly early on, where you feel in full command of the language, you're acculturated, you know all the codes, you can walk into any room and understand what might happen in that room. But I still believe that's just a dream of belonging. Because in the end, and it's not because the other people are treating you in a certain way, that might be part of it, but I think in the end, you always know that the way you are is always about arrival, you know, and that for me is that moment of arrival is the most fraught and interesting moment.
Yeah.
Because it with it is all the baggage of both what you bring and your experiences to that context, and then your expectations of that context in how has formed and is about to reform you.
Yeah.
And that for me is that, and so that's why I've, you know, at some point you could have the dream of belonging, say, oh no, I've got it all down. I teach at a major institution. I do this, I do that. I've published books. I speak to, you know, rooms of people. But in the end, it's not about the out there. The context is actually something that's been subsumed here.
You know, in some ways, this reminds me, I was in a similar conversation, but reversing the role. Somebody was asking questions. And I think that in passing, I described myself as an outsider who's been living. And the person very shrewdly and very politely and respectfully said, Ilan, an outsider, you've been here for 35 years, you teach at a wonderful school, you publish all these books, you have access to, you publish in newspapers. When do you stop being an outsider? And if you're an outsider, should the rest of us also consider ourselves? So maybe the question, throwing it back to you, Chang-rae, is the moment of arrival of immigrants always promised but never accomplished? And it's a psychological state of mind that I think or is it also a way of fooling ourselves? Yes, we have arrived. We are here. We are actually establishing a certain model and a certain pattern of how to do certain things, but we refuse to give up that position because it has been beneficial for us too.
Yeah, no, we use it as an argument on the plus side for whatever we've done or accomplished.
Right.
But I think if we are really interrogating it, and maybe this is more me than anyone else, the more I look at it, the more I interrogate it. It is that moment of arrival. And I'm not talking about arrival, that first initial arrival. I'm talking about every arrival into any moment It's again, it's not as if it's fraught, but if I really look at it, if I really try to tease it out, all these layers are there of a psyche that is gauging, is measuring, is, just to the tiniest degree is there. And I think that's the level of, that is a kind of state of being that certain people, I think, who have maybe, never left their community, know everything, that's true belonging.
Yeah.
But I think in our world, especially now the way it is, I think, yes, we are all becoming more attuned to what it feels like to have that anxiety of arrival. And in some ways, I think sometimes I feel sorry for people who really do belong. I envy them.
Yeah.
I envy them, but I also feel sorry for them, because it seems to me that that is my lens on how the world is vital.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. We were talking about your transition from Korean to English, your mother's languages, and I want to ask you at some point if you remember some of the earlier English language words that became an anchor in your process of becoming. But what I would like to ask you first is, in the time that you've been in this country and with the knowledge and the maturity that you have accumulated over time because you are a craftsman of language, how has the English language changed in those 50, 55 years? How different would you be in the way you speak, in the way you write, had you arrived 3 decades later or 4 decades later? And it goes hand in hand with another question, which is a segue to you as a teacher of many Asian American students. How different, not so much them being as immigrant, how different is the language of your students? I feel it. I love my students. I feel the difference between their English and my English. How different is it, and does it their language, your English, and does it create anxiety?
Yeah, well, the language that I grew up with, educated in, and loved, revered, that had much much different shape and form. I mean, I grew up reading blank verse. I grew up, reading Henry James. I grew up reading formal and formed language that was fairly rigid, very Western, very white, very Anglo. And that's just me. I can't escape that.
Yeah.
Right. I can't escape my learning. I can't escape, it's the jacket, that's the thing that I've put on, and now I can't take it off. But my students now, as your students, I'm sure, Ilan, are, they it's the language of everything now because of technology. And it's very exciting to me in a certain sense, because they can pull from so many different kinds of discourses, languages, cultures in a moment. In a moment's thought, they can do that. My last novel, My Year Abroad, the hero is a 20-year-old living in New Jersey, and he tells the story, and even though at some points he probably sounds like a middle-aged man, I tried to honor something that I found about my students, who of course never grow old, but are living in the culture.
The only one that ages in the classroom is the teacher, right?
That's right. But one of the things I love about teaching is just encountering the exuberance and energy of the language that my students bring to their work.
Yeah.
And the kinds of things that they draw on, which are unlikely and, I can't anticipate. They're the things that they like and give them delight are also are quite various. It's not like they just are doing things that are quote unquote contemporary. They are true, I think, grazers, browsers, and talk about sponges. It's a sponge from my sponge was from a small community in suburban New York City. Now anyone can bring it from so many different directions.
Yeah. Is there in you, Chang-rae, when you were using the adjectives to describe the jacket, and you didn't say this, but I almost heard straitjacket of the language that you were formed, and you formed yours as well. You used formal, somewhat rigid. And though you didn't use any similar adjectives for the language of your students, it gave me the impression that it is exuberant and multifarious and very malleable and flexible, and it's capable of absorbing this, you did say, from many registers and bringing it back.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that exuberance, that multiplicity, has its dangers?
Well, I don't know about dangers, but I think it can feel, I think, sometimes, and I see this sometimes in my students' work, that there's no, sometimes I feel as if there's no anchor. And anchored, not in terms of language necessarily, but a psychic anchor needs to be there.
Yeah.
An anchor of consciousness.
And do you think that the absence of anchor is dangerous?
I don't know about dangerous, but I think I think that's why we read things. We want to know about the drama of a consciousness. Right? I mean, that's what, and whether that consciousness is looking at itself or looking at the world or thinking about language or thinking about art, we want that drama. Yeah. But we want to be able to step by step experience that drama. And I think sometimes form is very important. Often it is, right? I mean, it houses us, it constricts us sometimes, but in the constriction, as we all know,
there's freedom.
It can come a new world.
Sure.
So I think again, it's an illusion of that this world has so many different, that multiplicity is wonderful, but in some ways it's also not the world. Right? The world is still here. I think it's still the way in which we contextualize it.
Yeah.
In this very moment for us. And that one little flash, sometimes does require some structure.
Yeah.
Some kind of housing.
Some kind of housing, and house and home, of course, are central to the whole quest of literature in general, but of course the literature of immigrants in particular. I am switching kind of spontaneously to some of the questions that have shown up, and here's one, Chang-rae. The phenomenon of third culture kids, children of third mixed cultures who relate to either culture they grew up in or have heritage in, has been gaining momentum among the children of immigrants. How can we help our children / friends experiencing this feel part of both instead of distant to either of them?
Well, my kids are mixed kids. They have many different cultures running through their lives and their bodies, and I found, in seeing them grow up, my children now are in their 20s. I see them putting things on, taking things off, deciding this is a straitjacket, deciding, no, this is something I want to wear for a while. And I think it's just about being kind of being there along on the ride,
Yeah.
along on that journey, and asking questions about it. And I don't think you need to point anything out. I don't think you can. I don't think you can force culture down someone's throat. You can't. They'll find it themselves. The same way, a lot of adopted kids will kind of look for their origins,
Yeah.
whether they're painful or not, whether that leads to any kind of illumination or enlightenment. It's
Absolutely.
just something that they're just drawn to it. And I think that's the same thing with the various cultures that run through my kids' lives. And it's wonderful because they in some ways they can choose at certain times in their lives. This is what I want. This is what I want. Just as I did, there are points in my life in which I probably not reject my Koreanness, but it was just put off to the side, and I was just focusing on other things. And I think as I grow older, I'm more and more attracted to it. I wondered if that's the same for you. And I don't know what that really comes from. Is it an emotional thing?
It's amazing to age, how in the act and art of aging, and of course the body ages in one way, and then the spirit or the mind or whatever other component we're going to use the term to describe it, ages in a different way, or maybe resists the aging process. It's interesting how aspects that I thought were way back and solved or not coming, all of a sudden acquire. The death of my parents happened about 3 and then 1 year ago, and they awaken all kinds of emotions that I didn't expect, that don't really have to do with them, have to do with, when my grandmother died, my mother, I remember, told me, now there's nobody between me and the grave. And it stayed with me. And when she died, it's what I thought. Now there's nobody between me and the grave. And so there's all this moments that you start thinking, what would have happened with a land that stayed? How different would it be from the land that came here? And I want to ask you 2 questions. I want to ask you many more questions, but the time, as always, is the tyrant here. When I see myself translated, not by myself, Chang-rae, into Spanish, when I see myself translated into any other language, I feel proud, happy. Some languages I know, and I might be able to spot something that makes me uncomfortable, that I would have made another choice in terms of the translation, but I surrendered that effort. It wasn't mine. Somebody else is doing it. But when I see myself translated into Spanish, when I didn't do the translation myself, I feel even more foreign than when I am here or I have been here. I feel as if somebody is bringing me back home, but my home is now different. It tastes different, it feels different, and it's no longer mine, really. It's kind of a statement. I wonder what your reaction is when you see yourself translated into Korean.
Well, my Korean language skill for that level is not there. I can't do it. So I can't be the judge.
Yeah.
My Korean's very basic, so I don't have that same experience.
Yeah. Do you feel that you're coming home though, when somebody translates you into Korean?
Oh yeah, I'm always there. Of course, there's a different kind of gleam when I know that my Year Abroad, my latest novel, is just released in Korean in Korea, and
right.
And so I have a special feeling about that one. I do have lots of questions about how that really is coming across, because it's a very particular, as all books are, a particular kind of voice, particular kind of sense of being, and I wondered if that can really be translated in the Korean, and one just hopes.
Yeah. Here's another question, Chang-rae. We talk about Korean, or we talk about Spanish, or we talk about English as if they were monolithic languages. And, you know, I gave up my Spanish and embraced English, or I gave up my Korean and embraced English. But different groups, there's many ways to enter follow this question. One of the things that some groups have done is that middle step of Yinglish, the mix of Yiddish and English, or Chinglish, meaning a language that remains the original language, is contaminating, and I deliberately use a term that the purist would be invoking, and then passes on to being, after 10 years or 20 or 50, a full-fledged English language. And certain groups, I've been fascinated almost since I arrived to this country by Spanglish, because Spanglish is so many things. It's a message of, you're not really giving all this up, but we're not keeping it the same way either. We're inventing something new. And of course, it generates an entire controversy around, are you not really learning the English language? Are you polluting the Spanish language? And more often, you see texts that are in Spanglish. There are many texts that are in English, but many texts that are in Spanglish of Romeo and Juliet, or
really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, or dialogues in novels and so on. So I wonder if there was any, I don't know what the word would be for Korean English.
Konglish.
Konglish. If you have any feelings about Konglish, if Konglish was part of your life, is part of your life, the life of your children, if it's a literary form too, or it's only a game, what are your views? I see Spanglish as an authentic form of communication.
Yeah, and that's because of the pervasiveness of Spanish and Spanish-speaking people in the United States. You know, maybe I don't think that'll ever be the case with Koreans. Maybe with Korean culture. I know Korean culture is now taking over America.
Yes.
But that doesn't really mean Konglish, right? It's just certain words that people now know, certain food items or whatever, pop cultural references. But Konglish is its own thing that I never really. And I think it's because I didn't grow up with, my mother, again, I left the home when I'm going to boarding school for high school. And so we didn't, again, have any older generation people. And so there really was no Konglish in my experience. And I read, sometimes I'll see Konglish, I'm kind of amused by it, but I've never used it myself. And most
of you have a negative reaction toward it?
Not negative, just kind of, curious, and and I find it kind of delightful sometimes, but I don't and the community of Korean Americans that I'm with, we speak English with each other. And it's very different for, say, my cousins who came here when they were much older, in their late teens or 20s, who speak Korean with their Korean friends, Korean American friends, and maybe some Konglish too. So it's not, I think it's a very different animal than Spanglish, where I have seen in novels, English language novels, where you'll see whole sections in Spanglish.
Right.
And you understand, of course, that that's completely right. That's how it should be.
All right. And to wrap things up, because we really are at the end, Chang-rae, I think, please correct me, of all the books that you've written, without exception, they are fiction.
Yes.
And I wonder if, just one quick remark, immigrant literature is a difficult animal to define. The story of immigrants is often not told by immigrants themselves. It's told by their children or by others because they were busy working, or they didn't have the skills or the language skills, etc. And when it comes out later on, it's often as memoirs. because they want to tell the story as is. I wonder if you have had the temptation, the allure of switching at any point to writing a full-fledged memoir or a section of your life into a memoir, and your relationship. We talked about your relationship with a Korean and with English. Now it's between fiction and nonfiction.
Well, I have written, the nonfiction I write is pretty much exclusively about, it's not reportage, it's memoir.
Yeah.
And so, and I don't have any plans to write a full-length memoir at any time soon. I will tell you that the novel that I'm working on now is semi-autobiographical.
Yeah.
Probably much more so. I mean, much more so than any of my other novels. My other novels are not autobiographical, really, at all.
Yeah.
But this one is, it's concerns a Korean American boy, 10 years old in the suburbs of New York City, and a lot of the things that happened to him happened to me. But of course, it goes in a fictional digression that I'm glad didn't happen to me. So, but I'm absolutely more and more interested in looking back at my life and back at the things that I experienced and the ways in which I think, again, as we're talking from the beginning, how we were formed,
right?
And then the reaction to that formation, which I think is endlessly, kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, my dear friend, it's always a joy to be in contact and in communication. This was delightful. I appreciate it enormously. I keep on being the reader on the page, but occasionally have the opportunity of being on the screen or on the stage with you, and it's much appreciated.
Well, thank you, Ilan. It was great to talk to you as always, and I hope it was fun for you as it is for me. Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
Muchas gracias. Ciao.
Okay, ciao.